March 1945. Somewhere in the German countryside near the Rhine River, the convoy of American trucks rumbled to a stop outside a bombed-out factory building, and Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped down from the lead vehicle, her boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Inside that building were 42 German women, all former factory workers who had been conscripted into forced labor camps, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. What happened next would challenge everything both sides believed about their enemies, proving that humanity could survive even the darkest chapters of war. These weren't just prisoners. They were women who had been stripped of dignity, forced into servitude, and told by their own government that Americans were monsters. In the coming hours, they would discover the truth was far different from the propaganda they had been fed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The women huddled together in the corner of the factory floor, their clothes tattered and stained, their hair matted and unwashed for months. Many had worked 16-hour shifts in ammunition factories before the collapse of German infrastructure left them abandoned. When the American Third Army swept through the region in early March, these women expected the worst. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as ruthless invaders who would show no mercy. The reality of their situation was complicated. They weren't exactly prisoners of war in the traditional sense, but they weren't free either. They existed in a gray area, civilian workers trapped by circumstance, scared of both their former overseers and their new captors. Lieutenant Chen had seen dozens of similar situations in the past 3 months. The advance through Germany revealed countless displaced persons, forced laborers, and civilians caught in the machinery of total war. But something about this particular group struck her differently. These weren't hardened Nazi supporters. They were ordinary women, seamstresses, and teachers and shopkeepers before the war, pressed into factory service as Germany's manpower crisis deepened. Their eyes showed not defiance, but terror. They flinched at sudden movements. Several bore bruises and scars from brutal factory supervisors. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17. The oldest looked 70, but was probably 50, aged by hardship and deprivation. The American soldiers who discovered them had provided basic medical care and rations. The women ate ravenously, some crying as they consumed the first adequate meal they had eaten in weeks. But they remained silent, watchful, expecting punishment, or worse. Their previous German supervisors had fled as American forces approached, leaving them locked in the factory with minimal supplies. They had been there for 3 days before the Third Army arrived, surviving on rainwater and scraps. When American soldiers broke down the doors, the women screamed, certain their final moments had arrived. Instead, they received blankets, hot soup, and assurances in broken German that they were safe now. Lieutenant Chen spoke to her commanding officer, Major Patterson, a career soldier from Texas who had seen action since North Africa. He was practical, efficient, and surprisingly compassionate for a man hardened by years of combat. When Chen proposed her idea, he raised an eyebrow, but didn't dismiss it outright. The suggestion seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. They were in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by destroyed infrastructure and ongoing military operations. Resources were precious, focused on advancing the front lines and supporting combat troops. But Chen persisted, arguing that what these women needed went beyond food and shelter. They needed their humanity restored. The nearest intact town was Heidelberg, recently occupied by American forces with minimal fighting. The historic university city had been spared the worst of the bombing, its Baroque architecture largely intact. Among the surviving businesses was a small hair salon on a side street near the old bridge, owned by Frau Muller, a widow in her 50s who had kept her shop open throughout the war by cutting hair for German officers and their wives. When American forces arrived, she continued operating, now serving American personnel. Her salon had survived because it occupied the ground floor of a stone building that had withstood nearby explosions. The mirrors were cracked, supplies were limited, but it was functional. Major Patterson made the arrangements through the local military government office. The Salon would be requisitioned for 1 day, compensation provided through military scrip. Transportation would be arranged using supply trucks returning from the front. Security would be minimal but present. The entire operation would take 1 day, after which the women would be processed through the standard displaced persons system and eventually repatriated or resettled depending on their individual circumstances. It was an unusual request, perhaps even frivolous by military standards, but Patterson had learned that rebuilding a conquered nation required more than military force. It required gestures of normalcy and dignity. On the morning of March 18, 1945, the women were told they would be leaving the factory. Panic rippled through the group. Where were they being taken? What would happen to them? Several began crying, assuming they were being transferred to a prison camp or worse. Lieutenant Chen tried to explain in her limited German, but the language barrier and the women's terror made communication nearly impossible. Finally, she enlisted Corporal Mueller, a German-American soldier from Milwaukee whose parents had immigrated in the 1920s. He spoke fluent German and could convey the message clearly. Even then, the women didn't believe it. A hair salon? It made no sense. Surely this was a cruel trick, a way to give them false hope before some terrible fate. The trucks rolled through the German countryside, passing destroyed villages and abandoned military equipment. The women sat in the back, silent and tense, holding on to each other for comfort. Some prayed quietly. Others stared blankly at the passing landscape, their faces showing the exhaustion of people who had endured too much for too long. The American soldiers accompanying them tried to be reassuring, offering cigarettes and chocolate, but the women remained wary. They had been conditioned by years of propaganda to fear Americans, and despite the kindness shown so far, old fears died hard. The journey took 90 minutes, the trucks moving slowly to avoid potholes and debris on damaged roads. Heidelberg appeared through the morning mist, its castle ruins overlooking the Neckar River, the old bridge spanning the water like something from a storybook. The women stared in wonder at the intact buildings, so different from the rubble-strewn landscapes they had grown accustomed to. The trucks navigated narrow streets, finally stopping outside a modest building with a faded sign reading Salon Mueller. The door was painted blue, peeling but still cheerful. Window boxes that once held flowers now sat empty, but the windows themselves were clean, the interior visible through lace curtains. It looked so ordinary, so peacefully normal, that several women began crying again. This time not from fear, but from the shock of seeing something untouched by war's destruction. Frau Mueller stood in the doorway, a stout woman with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a clean white apron over a simple dress. Her face showed the weariness common to all Germans by March 1945, the exhaustion of years of war and deprivation. But her eyes were kind. She had been briefed on the situation by the American military government officer, told that these were displaced women who needed care and dignity. She had agreed immediately, remembering her own daughter who had died in an Allied bombing raid 2 years earlier. Perhaps this was a way to honor that memory, to do something good in a world that had seen too much evil.
combs. It looked like something from before the war, a fragment of normal life preserved against impossible odds. Frau Müller began speaking in German, her voice calm and maternal. She explained that they were here to receive proper hair care, that they would be washed and cut and treated with respect. She had enlisted help from 2 younger women, neighbors who had worked as assistants before the war. Together they would work through the entire group, taking as long as necessary. There was no rush, no schedule to maintain beyond the day itself. American soldiers would wait outside, providing security but giving the women privacy. This was their time, their space, their moment to reclaim something that had been taken from them. The first woman sat in the chair, and Frau Müller draped a clean cape around her shoulders. The woman stiffened at the touch, then gradually relaxed as Frau Müller began running warm water, testing the temperature, adjusting it to be comfortable. The sight of clean water flowing freely, not rationed or polluted, brought fresh tears. Frau Müller began washing the matted hair with gentle hands, working through tangles patiently, speaking softly in German, reassuring words about the weather and the spring flowers that would soon bloom, and how beautiful the woman's natural hair color was beneath the dirt and grime. It was ordinary conversation, the kind hairdressers had been having with clients for generations, and that very ordinariness was healing. The other women watched in silence as the transformation began. The warm water turned brown, then gray, then finally ran clear. Frau Müller applied shampoo, a precious commodity she had been saving for special occasions, and worked it through the woman's hair with practiced efficiency. The scent filled the salon, clean and floral, so different from the industrial smells and unwashed bodies the women had grown accustomed to. Several women closed their eyes, breathing deeply, letting the simple pleasure of a pleasant smell wash over them. It was such a small thing, yet it represented everything they had lost and were now, impossibly, beginning to reclaim. After washing, Frau Müller began cutting, her scissors moving with practiced precision. She removed the damaged ends, shaped the remaining hair into something manageable and flattering, transforming the matted mess into a simple but dignified style. When she finished and turned the chair so the woman could see herself in the mirror, the reaction was immediate and profound. The woman stared at her reflection, raising a trembling hand to touch her clean hair, her face crumpling as she began to sob. Not from sadness, but from recognition. She saw herself again, not the hollow-eyed prisoner she had become, but a glimpse of the person she had been before the war consumed everything. The process continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Each woman received the same careful attention, the same gentle treatment, the same transformation. Some wanted their hair cut short, practical and easy to manage. Others wanted to keep length, holding on to something familiar. Frau Müller accommodated every request, working with what she had, making each woman feel heard and valued. Her assistants moved efficiently, preparing the next client, cleaning up after each cut, maintaining the flow. The American soldiers outside could hear crying through the door, but also laughter. The first genuine laughter these women had expressed in months, perhaps years.
The warm water, the gentle hands, the clean mirrors showing their reflections, all of it confirmed that they were still human, still worthy of kindness and attention. "It sounds dramatic," Greta said through the translation, "to claim that a haircut could restore humanity, but you have to understand what it's like to lose your humanity first, to be reduced to a number and a production quota, to forget that you once had a name and a life and dreams for the future." This simple act reminded them of all that, brought it flooding back in ways they hadn't anticipated. Lieutenant Chen listened, understanding more than Greta might have expected. Chen herself was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco to immigrant parents who had fled political upheaval in their homeland. She understood what it meant to be seen as perpetually foreign, to have your humanity questioned based on appearance or origin. The war had given her opportunities to prove herself, to serve her country and demonstrate loyalty that shouldn't have needed demonstration but did. She had risen through the ranks despite prejudice, earning respect through competence and dedication. Now she found herself in Germany, helping former enemy civilians reclaim their dignity. And the irony wasn't lost on her. War created strange circumstances, unexpected connections, moments of grace amid chaos. As the afternoon wore on, the transformation of the group became increasingly visible. Clean, styled hair changed faces, made them younger, brought color back to cheeks that had been gray with exhaustion. The women began talking to each other, sharing stories, rediscovering connections that hardship had frayed. They complimented each other's new styles, suggested slight adjustments, laughed at shared memories of better times. The salon became a space of community and healing, walls holding conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. They discussed recipes they would cook again someday, places they wanted to visit, family members they hoped to reunite with. They made plans for futures that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Frau Müller worked tirelessly, her hands moving with skill developed over decades of practice. She had cut hair for wealthy merchants and poor laborers, for brides preparing for weddings and widows mourning husbands. She had styled hair for children's first days of school and old women's final photographs. Each client had been unique. Each head of hair presented different challenges and possibilities. These women were no different in that regard. The gray-haired grandmother received a soft, flattering cut that took years off her appearance. The young blonde got a modern style that emphasized her delicate features. The middle-aged woman with thick, curly hair finally had it properly shaped and managed. Each transformation was personal, tailored, considered. The American soldiers outside smoked cigarettes and played cards, occasionally glancing at the salon door, hearing the sounds of life and laughter emerging from within. Sergeant Williams, a farm boy from Iowa, remarked to Lieutenant Chen that he had never expected to spend a day in Germany guarding a hair salon. He had imagined combat and danger, heroic actions and clear enemies. Instead, he was watching over a group of scared women getting haircuts. And somehow, this felt more important than anything he had done in weeks of fighting. It was harder to hate an enemy when you saw them as individuals with hopes and fears, people who wanted the same basic things everyone wanted: safety, dignity, a chance at normal life. As the evening approached, the final women received their treatments. Frau Müller's hands ached, her back protested from hours of standing and bending, but she didn't complain or rush. Each woman deserved the same careful attention as the first. Her assistants had long since stopped maintaining professional detachment, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed transformation after transformation. This was more than cosmetic improvement. It was resurrection of spirits thought dead, rekindling of hopes thought extinguished. The mirrors reflected not just clean hair and fresh styles, but the beginning of healing, the first steps back toward wholeness. When the last woman stood from the chair and saw herself in the mirror, she began singing softly in German, an old folk song about spring and new beginnings.
Others joined in, their voices blending in harmony, filling the small salon with music that spoke of resilience and survival. The American soldiers outside heard it and fell silent, understanding without translation that they were witnessing something sacred. War had taught them to destroy, but here was creation, rebuilding not of buildings or bridges, but of human souls. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, but it was real, and it mattered more than any military victory. Lieutenant Chen arranged for the women to stay overnight in a requisitioned hotel near the American military headquarters. The building had survived the war largely intact, though its former elegance showed signs of wear and neglect. Still, it offered clean beds, running water, and safety, luxuries these women hadn't experienced in years. As they filed into the lobby, their newly styled hair catching the evening light, streaming through tall windows, other American soldiers stopped to stare, not with hostility or suspicion, but with curiosity and something approaching respect. These weren't the defeated, broken people they had expected to find in Germany. These were women reclaiming their dignity, standing a little straighter, meeting eyes instead of staring at the ground. That night, the women gathered in a large common room on the second floor. Someone had found an old phonograph and a collection of records, mostly classical music and pre-war German folk songs. The music played softly while the women talked. Really talked, for the first time in months. They shared stories of their lives before the war, memories of normalcy that felt like they belonged to different people entirely. Anna had been a nurse in Munich, working in a children's hospital, bringing comfort to sick kids and worried parents. Margareta had taught literature at a gymnasium in Stuttgart, inspiring students to love Goethe and Schiller. Helga had run a small bakery with her husband, famous in their neighborhood for apple strudel that people lined up to buy every Sunday morning. The war had stolen these identities, reduced them to interchangeable factory workers, producing bullets and shells for a cause most of them had never believed in. They had been threatened, coerced, sometimes beaten into compliance. Refusing work meant imprisonment or worse, and many had families they were trying to protect. So they had endured, day after day, month after month, watching their hands grow calloused and their spirits grow numb. They had stopped looking in mirrors because they couldn't recognize the hollow-eyed strangers staring back. They had stopped thinking about the future because imagining better days only made the present more unbearable. Survival became the only goal, getting through each shift without injury or punishment. But something had shifted during those hours in the Salon. The physical transformation was obvious, visible in every mirror and reflection. Yet the deeper change was internal, psychological. A reconnection with the people they had been before trauma reshaped them. Seeing themselves with clean, styled hair reminded them of Saturday mornings preparing for church, of Friday evenings getting ready for dances, of ordinary days when appearance mattered, not because someone would punish them for looking wrong, but because taking care of themselves was an expression of self-respect and hope. Those memories had seemed lost forever, buried under layers of suffering and survival. The Salon visit excavated them, brought them back to the surface where they could be examined and cherished. Greta, the former school teacher, found herself thinking about her students, wondering where they were now, if they had survived the war, if they remembered the lessons about literature and history she had tried to impart. She had taught them that education was liberation, that knowledge opened doors and expanded possibilities. Then the Nazis had twisted education into propaganda, turned schools into indoctrination centers, and Greta had been forced out for refusing to teach the party line. She ended up in the factory, her education useless in a world that valued obedience over intelligence. But tonight, with clean hair and renewed hope, she began to think about teaching again.
Somewhere, children would need education after this war ended. Somewhere, her skills and passion might matter again. Anna, the former nurse, examined her hands in the lamplight. They were scarred and rough from factory work, so different from the gentle, capable hands that had once started IVs and changed bandages and held the hands of frightened children. She had wondered if she could ever go back to nursing, if patients would trust hands that had built weapons of destruction. But Lieutenant Chen had shown her something important today. The American officer had gentle hands, too, hands that helped women down from trucks and offered reassurance through touch. Those hands also wore a military uniform and carried a service pistol. War required people to do hard things, to compromise their ideals for survival. The question wasn't whether you had been forced to participate in evil, but what you chose to do when given the opportunity to create good again. The youngest woman in the group, a 17-year-old named Liesel, sat quietly in the corner, listening to the older women talk.
She had been pulled from school at 15 when Germany's labor crisis became desperate. The past 2 years represented her entire adolescence, stolen by a war she hadn't started and couldn't comprehend. She had no career to return to, no professional identity to reclaim. But today's experience taught her something valuable about human kindness and unexpected grace. The Americans could have treated them as enemies or ignored them entirely. Instead, they had recognized suffering and responded with compassion. Frau Müller could have refused to help, bitter about her own losses and hardships. Instead, she had opened her salon and her heart, offering skilled care to women she had never met. These examples of goodness, small acts of decency in a world torn apart by hatred and violence, gave Liesel hope for the future. If people could choose kindness even after years of war, if enemies could become helpers, if dignity could be restored with warm water and scissors and gentle hands, then maybe the world wasn't permanently broken. Maybe healing was possible, not just for individuals, but for entire societies. It was a lot to place on a single day at a hair salon, but young people grasp at hope wherever they can find it, building futures from fragments of possibility. Major Patterson visited the hotel that evening, wanting to check on the women and ensure everything was proceeding smoothly. He found them animated and engaged, so different from the terrified group he had seen just yesterday. Lieutenant Chen briefed him on the day's events, the successful salon visit, the positive transformation, the plans for processing them through the displaced persons system starting tomorrow. Patterson nodded approvingly, then did something unexpected. He asked Chen to translate an apology to the women, not for defeating Germany or fighting the war, but for not arriving sooner, for all the suffering they had endured before American forces could reach them. It was a genuine expression of regret from a career soldier who understood that war's victims extended far beyond combat casualties. The women listened through Chen's translation, many crying again. But these were different tears. They were tears of release, of tension finally breaking, of burdens being acknowledged by someone with authority and power. For years, their suffering had been invisible, irrelevant to the German war machine that only cared about production quotas. Now an American major was acknowledging their pain, expressing regret for circumstances beyond his control. It didn't undo the past or erase the trauma, but it mattered. Recognition of suffering is itself a form of healing, validation that your pain was real and unjust and worth acknowledging. Over the following weeks, the 42 women were processed through the American Displaced Persons System. Each received medical examinations, identifying various ailments from malnutrition to untreated injuries to stress-related conditions. Treatment began immediately, not just physical care, but psychological support from Army counselors who had been trained to help traumatized civilians. The women were interviewed about their backgrounds, their skills, their families, their wishes for the future. Some wanted to return to their hometowns, hoping to find surviving relatives and rebuild shattered lives. Others had nothing to return to, their homes destroyed and families scattered or dead.
These women faced uncertain futures in a defeated nation with a devastated economy. Lieutenant Chen continued visiting them when her duties allowed. She had become something of a guardian angel to the group, checking on their well-being, helping navigate bureaucratic challenges, ensuring they received proper treatment and consideration. The women responded to her care with gratitude and affection, treating her like a beloved younger sister, despite the uniform she wore. They asked about her life, her family, her plans after the war. Chen shared stories of growing up in San Francisco, of parents who had fled China seeking better opportunities, of a childhood navigating between Chinese traditions at home and American culture outside. Her story resonated with women who now faced similar challenges, caught between the Germany they had known and whatever came next. Several women asked Chen about America, what it was really like beyond the propaganda images they had been fed. Was it true that people of all backgrounds could succeed based on merit? Were there really cities where different ethnicities lived together peacefully? Could someone rebuild a life there, start over completely? Chen answered honestly, acknowledging both opportunities and challenges. America wasn't perfect. Prejudice existed, inequality persisted, barriers remained for those who looked different or spoke with accents. But possibilities existed too, chances to work hard and build better lives. Freedoms that many Americans took for granted but meant everything to people who had lived under totalitarian control. Some of the women applied for immigration to America through the Displaced Persons Program. Anna, the former nurse, dreamed of working in an American hospital, bringing her skills to a country that valued medical professionals. Greta, the teacher, wanted to educate American children, share her love of literature in a place where intellectual freedom was protected. Marguerite, who had worked in her family's textile business before the war, hoped to find work in America's garment industry, rebuild financial stability and independence. The application process was lengthy and uncertain, with quotas and restrictions limiting how many could be accepted. But the possibility itself provided motivation, a tangible goal to work toward while rebuilding strength and health. Others chose to remain in Germany, determined to rebuild their homeland despite its devastation. Helga, the former baker, wanted to return to her neighborhood in Cologne, see if her shop could be salvaged, reconnect with any surviving neighbors and customers. She knew the challenges would be immense. The city had been heavily bombed, infrastructure destroyed, the economy in ruins. But it was her home, filled with memories both beautiful and painful. Starting over somewhere else felt like abandoning not just a place, but her entire identity, all the years and experiences that had made her who she was. Better to face the hard work of rebuilding in familiar surroundings than to become a permanent stranger in a foreign land. The women stayed in touch as they dispersed to different destinations. Letters began circulating within weeks, sharing updates and encouragement. Anna wrote from a refugee camp in Frankfurt, waiting for her immigration papers to be processed, working as a volunteer nurse treating other displaced persons. Greta sent a letter from Stuttgart, where she had found temporary work teaching children in a makeshift school organized by relief workers. Margarita wrote from Munich, living with distant relatives, slowly rebuilding connections with her pre-war life. Each letter mentioned the day at the Salon, the moment everything changed, when they stopped being victims and became people again. Frau Müller received a collective thank you letter signed by all 42 women. They had pooled resources to send it, wanting her to know the impact of her kindness. The letter described how that single day had given them strength to face everything that followed, how the memory of her gentle hands and patient care sustained them through difficult moments. They promised to remember her always, to tell their children and grandchildren about the German widow who opened her salon to former enemy workers and treated them with dignity and respect when they needed it most. Faced severe shortages, Margaret documented everything, recognizing that American practical knowledge might save more lives than medical training in starving populations. This willingness to share survival skills with former enemies exemplified generosity beyond obligation. Navigation lessons from sympathetic officers revealed strategic thinking. Understanding shipping routes, port facilities, and transportation networks would help women reunite scattered families. Lieutenant Commander Stevens, whose son was missing in the Pacific, spent evening hours teaching basic logistics to interested passengers. His investment in their futures, despite personal loss, demonstrated American capacity for seeing beyond immediate conflict toward long-term stability. The ship's hospital became a training center as Margaret expanded medical education. American medics shared field treatment techniques perfected in Pacific campaigns. German nurses learned triage methods for mass casualties, relevant for cities still clearing rubble-trapped survivors. This exchange of practical knowledge, initiated by Americans who had every reason for bitterness, prepared German women for challenges no traditional medical training anticipated.
Weather delays extended the voyage, testing everyone's patience. Storms forced rationing of food and water, providing unwelcome previews of German shortages. Yet American crews shared equally with passengers, maintaining principles of fair distribution despite technically being under no obligation to enemy nationals. This consistent ethical behavior, especially under stress, reinforced lessons about democracy's strength lying in principled behavior rather than emotional retaliation. British coast appearance triggered complex emotions. Women who had bombed London now approached as dependent refugees. Margaret watched companions wrestle with role reversals from attackers to supplicants. Yet British authorities maintained professional efficiency, processing documents without vindictiveness. This measured response to former enemies reinforced American lessons about democracy's strength lying in principled behavior rather than emotional retaliation. Southampton's devastation shocked even war veterans. German women who had last seen England through bomber sights now witnessed destruction they'd helped cause. Yet British civilians organizing relief efforts included German repatriates in food distributions without discrimination. This practical reconciliation, beginning before peace treaties, demonstrated democracy's capacity for pragmatic humanity. Margaret helped translate between British officials and German women, building bridges through medical necessity.
It became her favorite story, proof that goodness could survive even the worst circumstances. Lieutenant Chen received orders in June 1945, transferring her to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan continued. Before leaving, she visited as many of the women as she could reach, saying goodbye and wishing them well. They cried and embraced her, this Chinese-American officer who had seen their suffering and responded with compassion. They gave her small gifts, handmade items crafted from whatever materials they could find, a embroidered handkerchief from Anna, a hand-copied poem from Greta, a small wooden cross carved by Marguerite's uncle. These tokens meant everything to Chen, tangible reminders that military service encompassed more than combat and destruction. Sometimes it meant healing and restoration, building bridges between former enemies, recognizing shared humanity beneath uniforms and national identities. The story of the Salon Day spread through the American occupation forces, becoming something of a legend. Other units began similar initiatives, small gestures of kindness and dignity for displaced persons and former enemy civilians. A medical unit in Bavaria organized the Children's Party, providing toys and games and laughter to kids who had known only fear and deprivation. An engineering company rebuilt a playground in a small town, installing swings and slides salvaged from destroyed cities. These weren't official policies or ordered missions. They were individual choices by soldiers who recognized that winning the peace required different strategies than winning the war. Years later, when historians examined the American occupation of Germany, they would focus on major policies like the Marshall Plan and democratic reforms and denazification programs. These were undoubtedly important, reshaping Germany's political and economic structures. But the smaller gestures mattered too, the individual acts of kindness that helped ordinary Germans distinguish between the Nazi regime they had suffered under and the people trying to build something better. A hair salon visit couldn't undo years of trauma or erase the horrors of war, but it could remind broken people that they were still human, still worthy of care and respect, still capable of healing and hope. The 42 women carried that lesson forward into their post-war lives. Those who immigrated to America often became advocates for refugees and displaced persons, understanding from personal experience what it meant to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. They volunteered at resettlement agencies, helped new immigrants navigate unfamiliar systems, offered the same compassion they had received when they needed it most. Those who stayed in Germany contributed to reconstruction efforts, not just rebuilding buildings and infrastructure, but rehabilitating a society poisoned by Nazi ideology. They taught children, cared for the sick, created businesses, and participated in democratic institutions, proving through their lives that ordinary people could choose decency even after being forced to participate in evil. Anna eventually became a pediatric nurse in Chicago, working in an inner-city hospital serving poor and immigrant communities. She never forgot the fear in children's eyes when strangers wielded power over them, so she made her medical practice as gentle and reassuring as possible. Her colleagues marveled at her patience, her ability to calm frightened kids with soft words and careful touch. They didn't know about the 2 years in a German factory, about the day an American officer arranged for her to visit a hair salon, about the transformation that began with warm water and ended with renewed hope. These experiences shaped her approach to nursing, taught her that healing encompassed more than treating physical ailments. Greta became a professor of German literature at a small liberal arts college in Ohio, introducing American students to works by authors the Nazis had banned. She taught them that literature could be resistance, that preserving truth and beauty in the face of propaganda and hatred was itself a form of courage. Her students loved her classes, drawn by her passion and the way she made centuries-old texts feel relevant to contemporary struggles. Some noticed numbers tattooed on her forearm, evidence of time in a concentration camp system, though she never discussed those experiences in class. The scars were private, carried quietly alongside the strength forged through survival. The youngest, Liesel, grew up to become a social worker in Hamburg, dedicating her career to helping troubled youth find better paths. She understood how easily young people could be led astray, how desperation and fear could push them toward extremism and violence. She offered alternatives through education, opportunity, and genuine care. Many of the teenagers she helped came from broken homes, damaged by poverty or abuse or abandonment. She saw herself in their eyes, remembered being 17 and lost and afraid, saved by unexpected kindness from former enemies. If strangers could show her compassion when circumstances gave them every reason to show cruelty, she could extend the same grace to troubled kids who needed someone to believe in them. The ripple effects of that single day in March 1945 extended far beyond the 42 women who received haircuts. Their children heard the story, learned that enemies could become helpers, that kindness could survive hatred, that humanity persisted even in war's darkest moments. These children grew up with different values, less likely to dehumanize others or accept propaganda that painted entire peoples as monsters. They became teachers, doctors, business leaders, politicians, spreading influence across post-war Germany and beyond. The investment of one day, some warm water, scissors, and genuine care yielded returns that compounded across generations. Lieutenant Sarah Chen returned from the Pacific in late 1945 after Japan's surrender ended the Second World War. She left the military in 1946, using the GI Bill to attend law school, eventually becoming an advocate for civil rights and immigration reform. She never forgot the German women or the lessons learned from helping them. Her legal career focused on defending the vulnerable, ensuring that people caught in systems beyond their control received fair treatment and dignity. She argued cases involving Japanese Americans seeking redress for internment, immigrants fighting deportation, workers facing exploitation. Each case connected to that day in Heidelberg when she recognized that official enemies were individual people deserving compassion. The Salon itself survived into the 21st century, still operated by descendants of Frau Müller. A small plaque near the door commemorates the day in March 1945 when 42 women received more than haircuts. It tells the story briefly, mentioning Lieutenant Chen by name, honoring Frau Müller's kindness, celebrating the moment when humanity triumphed over hatred. Visitors sometimes stop to read the plaque, tourists and locals alike, reflecting on what it means to choose compassion when circumstances would excuse cruelty. The Salon continues cutting hair, ordinary people receiving ordinary services, carrying forward a legacy built on the understanding that small acts of dignity and respect can transform lives and reshape futures.